The paperwork was signed in the shade of a massive California oak, witnessed by 7 men who would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what they'd seen. June 7, 1871. Outside a sprawling ranch house in Kern County, 20 miles from the booming town of Bakersfield, Thomas Mercer Whitfield, one of the wealthiest landowners in the southern San Joaquin Valley, stood beside his only daughter and handed her life over to a man he barely knew. The terms were simple and stomach-turning. Whitfield would receive 1 Andalusian stallion, bloodlines traced back to Spanish royal stables, valued at $800. In exchange, Diego Cortez, a horse trader who'd arrived in California 5 years earlier from Sonora, Mexico, would take custody of Catherine Rose Whitfield, 23 years old, 319 pounds, educated at a San Francisco finishing school, and, according to her father's public statements over the previous 2 years, utterly unmarriageable and completely useless to his family's standing in Kern County society. The men who witnessed that transaction expected outrage, protests from Catherine, intervention from anyone who understood that what was happening violated every principle of civilized behavior. What they got instead was silence. Catherine signed her name in careful script, her face showing nothing. Diego Cortez signed with equal calm. Thomas Whitfield signed last, and when he looked up from the document, he was smiling. That smile would haunt the witnesses for decades. Because what none of them understood that June afternoon was that Diego Cortez hadn't stumbled into this arrangement. He'd engineered every moment of it, starting 18 months earlier when Thomas Whitfield had insulted him at a Bakersfield horse auction. And what Cortez did next over the following year would destroy everything the Whitfield family had built across 3 generations in California. This is the story of the most calculated revenge in the state's history, and the woman who became the weapon that executed it. Before we continue with how a Mexican horse trader turned one man's cruelty into perfect vengeance, take a moment to subscribe to The Sealed Room. Stories like this one, the dark corners of American history that got buried under prettier narratives, they need to be told, and your support helps us keep digging them up. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story belongs to all of us. These forgotten chapters of who we really were. The California that existed in 1871 bore little resemblance to the desperate gold rush chaos of 2 decades earlier. The easy gold was gone. The miners who'd survived had either struck it genuinely rich or learned to live with perpetual disappointment. What remained was agriculture, and agriculture had made men like Thomas Whitfield powerful in ways the gold rush never could. Kern County stretched across the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley like a massive bowl tilted toward the sky. The land was flat and brutal, baking under summer heat that could kill livestock and men with equal efficiency. But it was also rich. Rich in ways that patient men with capital and water rights could transform into generational wealth. Wheat, primarily. Vast fields of it stretching to horizons that seemed to curve with the earth. Cattle ranching in the foothills where the Sierra Nevada began its climb toward the eastern sky. Sheep in the higher elevations, and increasingly, experimentation with crops that could tolerate the valley's extremes. Cotton, alfalfa, fruit orchards in areas where irrigation could be managed. Thomas Whitfield had arrived in California in 1853, not as a miner but as something more calculating. He'd come from Tennessee with capital, 300 head of cattle, and a clear understanding that the real money in California wouldn't come from gold extraction, but from feeding the people who extracted it. He'd purchased 12,000 acres in Kern County for prices that seemed absurd to his relatives back east, but proved visionary within 5 years. By 1871, the Whitfield Ranch encompassed over 40,000 acres, employed 73 men, ran 4,000 head of cattle, and produced wheat yields that shipped as far as San Francisco and Portland. The ranch house reflected this success. 2 stories constructed from imported timber and local stone, with a wraparound porch that provided shade through the murderous summer afternoons. The house stood on a slight rise, offering views across Whitfield's holdings that seemed to stretch forever in 3 directions. Inside, the furnishings were elegant without being ostentatious. Thomas Whitfield understood that frontier California still judged excess differently than Eastern society, and he calibrated his displays of wealth accordingly. Comfortable, successful, but not so lavish as to provoke resentment from men whose labor made that comfort possible. Thomas had married in 1856, choosing a woman named Abigail Chambers, whose family owned significant property in Sacramento. The marriage was strategic, combining Whitfield's Southern Valley holdings with Chambers' family connections to state politics and San Francisco banking. Abigail brought a dowry of $30,000 in social positioning that helped Thomas transition from successful rancher to genuine member of California's emerging elite. Catherine Rose Whitfield was born in 1848, their only surviving child. 2 sons had followed, but both died in infancy from illnesses that frontier medicine couldn't address. The losses had devastated Abigail and made Catherine simultaneously precious and burdened with expectations she couldn't possibly fulfill. As the only surviving child, Catherine represented the Whitfield family's future. Her marriage would need to consolidate and expand their holdings, connect them to other powerful California families, and produce grandchildren who could inherit the empire Thomas was building. By the standards of 1871 Kern County society, Catherine's value was almost entirely matrimonial. Her education, accomplished at considerable expense at Miss Hartford's Academy in San Francisco, was meant to make her an attractive prospect for ambitious men from established families. She could read Latin, play piano with genuine skill, discuss literature and history with ease, and manage household accounts with precision. These accomplishments were meant to signal that she was worthy of marrying into California's upper class. But Catherine's weight had undermined all of this careful cultivation. She'd been a chubby child, pleasantly round in ways that her parents found endearing. But sometime around her 15th year, Catherine's size had begun increasing dramatically. The causes were complex and probably unknowable even if anyone had cared to investigate them seriously. She'd suffered a severe riding accident at 14 that had left her bedridden for months. During her recovery, eating had become one of the few pleasures available to her, and the habit had persisted long after her physical injuries healed. There were also whispers, never confirmed, about a humiliating incident at Miss Hartford's Academy involving a young man from a prominent San Francisco family. Catherine had returned from school in the middle of her final year, refusing to discuss what had happened, and her weight had increased steadily from that point forward. By her 20th birthday, Catherine weighed well over 250 pounds. By 23, she'd reached 319, a fact her father knew precisely because he'd forced her to submit to being weighed on the ranch's cattle scale after a particularly humiliating social event where she'd struggled to fit into a carriage. Thomas Whitfield's frustration with his daughter's situation had evolved from disappointment into something darker and more vindictive. He saw Catherine's size as a personal failure and a barrier to the social advancement he'd spent years orchestrating. The marriage prospects he'd carefully cultivated had evaporated. Young men from powerful families expressed polite interest until they actually met Catherine, then found reasons to pursue opportunities elsewhere. By 1869, Thomas had stopped trying to arrange suitable matches. Catherine had become, in his calculation, dead weight. She consumed resources, offered no social advantage, and would produce no strategic marriage alliance. Worse, her presence had become an embarrassment. At county social events, people stared. Women whispered behind fans. Men made jokes they thought were private, but which always seemed to reach Thomas's ears. The Whitfield family's status, so carefully constructed, felt perpetually undermined by the physical presence of Thomas's unmarriageable daughter. Catherine herself had retreated into a kind of internal exile within her own home. She spent her days in her room or in the ranch house library, reading voraciously and maintaining a correspondence with several women from her academy days who'd moved to San Francisco and other cities. She rarely appeared at meals, having her food brought to her rooms by the household staff. She avoided social gatherings entirely, saving her parents the embarrassment of explaining her absence. In effect, Catherine had made herself invisible within the Whitfield household, occupying space but offering nothing that her father valued. This was the situation into which Diego Cortés entered in December 1869, though at the time, no one could have anticipated how thoroughly he would exploit it. Diego Cortés had arrived in California in 1866, part of the steady flow of Mexican immigrants who moved north seeking opportunities in the post-gold rush economy. He came from Sonora, from a family that had been training and breeding horses for 5 generations. In his youth, he'd worked on ranches throughout northern Mexico, developing an almost supernatural ability to assess horseflesh and identify quality bloodlines. He could spot defects hidden by clever grooming, recognize temperament issues from how an animal held its ears, and evaluate a horse's potential value with accuracy that bordered on clairvoyance. By the time he reached California at 28, Diego had spent his entire adult life around horses and understood them better than he understood most people. He'd established himself in Bakersfield with a small property on the eastern edge of town where he maintained corrals and a modest barn. His business model was straightforward. He traveled throughout California and into Arizona and Nevada, buying horses that showed potential, but that their current owners undervalued. He'd bring these animals back to Bakersfield, rehabilitate and train them, then sell them for profits that could reach several 100% on the best transactions. He worked alone mostly, employing occasional help during busy periods but generally operating as a one-man enterprise. His Spanish accent and Mexican heritage placed him outside the social circles that governed Bakersfield and Kern County. Anglo ranchers did business with him because his horses were consistently superior, but they didn't invite him to their homes or include him in their social organizations. Diego accepted this exclusion with apparent indifference, focusing on his work and building a reputation that gradually expanded throughout the southern San Joaquin Valley. The incident that would eventually lead to the June 1871 transaction occurred at a Bakersfield horse auction in December 1869. Thomas Whitfield had attended, looking to purchase quality stock for his cattle operation. Diego had brought a 6-year-old gelding that showed promise for ranch work, solid build, good temperament, adequate for the kind of work Whitfield's operation required. The bidding had been competitive, but Thomas ultimately purchased the animal for $115, a fair price for the quality. 3 weeks later, Thomas appeared at Diego's property in Bakersfield, leading the horse and demanding a refund. The gelding had developed severe lameness in its right foreleg, Thomas claimed, and examination had revealed a bone spur that would make the animal permanently unsuitable for heavy work. Diego examined the horse carefully, noting that the lameness was real, but that the bone spur showed signs of recent trauma rather than progressive development. "This injury happened after you purchased the animal," Diego said in his careful English. "This was not present at the auction. Someone worked this horse too hard on rocky ground. That's what caused this. Are you calling me a liar?" Thomas's voice had gone cold. "I'm stating facts about this horse's condition. The injury is recent. 3 weeks ago, this animal was sound. Whatever happened occurred under your management." Thomas Whitfield stood there in the morning sun, his face darkening with an anger that had little to do with the horse and everything to do with a Mexican immigrant refusing to defer to a man of Thomas's standing. "You sold me damaged goods," Thomas said slowly, "and now you're trying to avoid responsibility by making excuses. This is theft, pure and simple, and I won't tolerate being cheated by someone like you." The phrase "someone like you" hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither man needed to articulate explicitly. Diego's expression remained neutral, but several people who witnessed the exchange later reported that his eyes had gone very cold. "The sale was fair," Diego said quietly. "You examined the animal before bidding. No one forced your purchase. What happened after you took possession is your responsibility, not mine." Their confrontation continued for another 10 minutes, with Thomas becoming increasingly loud and Diego maintaining his calm insistence that the sale had been legitimate. Finally, Thomas had mounted his horse and delivered his parting statement. "You've made an enemy today, Cortez, and I'll make certain everyone in Kern County knows that you're a cheat who sells damaged animals and then hides behind excuses. Your business here is finished." Diego had watched Thomas ride away, his face showing no emotion. But one of the stable hands who worked for Diego occasionally, a young Anglo man named Peter Sullivan, later reported that Diego had stood motionless for nearly 5 minutes after Thomas left, staring in the direction he'd gone. "I'll remember this," Diego had finally said, speaking to no one in particular. "And he'll remember it too when I'm done." The threat seemed empty at the time. What could a Mexican horse trader do to one of the most powerful landowners in Kern County? Thomas Whitfield had connections, wealth, social standing. Diego Cortez had horses and a small property on the edge of Bakersfield. The power differential seemed insurmountable. But Diego understood something about power that Thomas had forgotten in his decades of success. Power was about leverage, and leverage came from understanding what someone valued and being willing to threaten it. Over the following months, Thomas made good on his threat to damage Diego's reputation. He told the horse sale story repeatedly at Cattlemen's Association meetings, always emphasizing that Diego had knowingly sold damaged stock and then refused to make it right. He advised other ranchers to avoid doing business with the Mexican trader. He made it known that he considered Diego fundamentally dishonest, and in the close-knit world of Kern County agriculture, Thomas's opinion carried substantial weight. Diego's business suffered immediately. Several pending sales fell through after buyers heard Thomas's version of events. Ranchers who'd been regular customers started looking elsewhere for horses. By summer of 1870, Diego's income had dropped by more than half, and he was struggling to maintain his property and feed his remaining stock. But Diego wasn't fighting back through business channels. He was conducting research. Through connections in Bakersfield's Mexican community, people who worked as household staff and laborers on Anglo ranches throughout the valley, Diego began gathering information about Thomas Whitfield's family. He learned about Catherine's weight, her isolation, her father's obvious embarrassment about her situation. He learned about the failed marriage prospects and Thomas's increasingly bitter complaints about his unmarriageable daughter. He learned that Thomas viewed Catherine as a burden that cost him money and status while offering nothing in return. And slowly, across months of careful inquiry and observation, Diego began to formulate a plan that was so audacious, so perfectly calculated to exploit Thomas's weaknesses, that when he finally explained it to Peter Sullivan in early 1871, the young man had simply stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious," Peter had said. "That's not possible. No father would agree to such a thing." "Thomas Whitfield sees his daughter as property that's lost all value," Diego replied. "I'm going to offer him an opportunity to trade that worthless property for something he actually wants. And when he accepts, because he will accept, I'll own the thing he threw away, and I'll use it to destroy everything he values." The plan required one critical element, an animal so extraordinary that Thomas Whitfield would be willing to consider an unconscionable transaction to possess it. Diego had been searching for such an animal for months, traveling throughout California and as far south as Baja California, looking for the perfect horse. He found it in March 1871 at a private estate outside of Monterey. The owner was a Spanish colonial family that had maintained breeding operations in California since the 1790s, before Mexico had even won independence from Spain. Their bloodlines traced directly to Andalusian stock brought from royal stables in Seville and Córdoba. The stallion Diego purchased was 8 years old, standing 16 hands high, with the powerful build and elegant movement that defined the breed at its finest. His coat was a deep gray that appeared almost silver in certain light, and his disposition combined spirit with intelligence in ways that made him both challenging and magnificent to watch. The horse's bloodline could be documented back 7 generations to Spanish royalty's personal stables. This wasn't just a valuable animal. This was a piece of living history, the kind of horse that conferred status merely through ownership. Diego paid everything he had for the stallion, $1,200, which represented nearly his entire savings, plus a loan from a Mexican banker in Bakersfield who accepted Diego's reputation as collateral. The purchase was financially insane unless Diego's larger plan worked. If Thomas Whitfield refused the transaction Diego intended to propose, Diego would be ruined. He'd lost most of his business, spent all his money, and would have no way to recover. But Diego wasn't worried about Thomas refusing. He'd spent more than a year studying Thomas Whitfield, understanding his values, his weaknesses, his pride. And Diego knew, with the same certainty he applied to evaluating horses, that Thomas would accept the offer. Not immediately, perhaps, not without resistance, but eventually, inevitably, Thomas Whitfield would trade his daughter for the Andalusian stallion, because that trade would give him something beautiful and valuable in exchange for something he viewed as worthless and embarrassing. Diego's first move was deliberately calculated to maximize impact. In late April 1871, he rode the Andalusian stallion through downtown Bakersfield during the lunch hour when the streets were crowded with ranchers, merchants, and workers. He moved slowly, letting people see the animal's conformation and bearing. He stopped at the Tehachapi Saloon, a gathering place for cattlemen, and took his time tying the stallion to the rail outside. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered, and Diego answered questions about the horse's bloodline and training with precise detail that made clear this was no ordinary animal. Word spread quickly through Bakersfield's business community. By the next day, several ranchers had appeared at Diego's property making offers to purchase the stallion. Diego refused all of them, politely explaining that the horse wasn't for sale. He intended to build a breeding operation around the animal, he said, establishing bloodlines that would make him the premier source for quality stock throughout California. The story reached Thomas Whitfield within 3 days, carried by an associate who'd seen the stallion in Bakersfield and recognized its extraordinary quality. Thomas immediately traveled to town to see the animal himself, and Diego, who'd been expecting this, made certain he was working the stallion in his corral when Thomas arrived. Thomas stood at the fence for 20 minutes, watching Diego put the horse through movements that displayed its training and temperament. When Diego finally approached, Thomas's first words were predictable. "What's your price?" "He's not for sale," Diego replied. "I'll pay you $2,000. It was an extraordinary offer, nearly twice what Diego had paid, and more than most men in Kern County earned in several years. "Not for sale at any price," Diego said.
"I'm building my breeding operation around him."
"This horse represents my future in California." Thomas studied Diego for a long moment, his face showing the calculation of a man trying to determine if he was being manipulated. "You've made it clear you blame me for your business problems," Thomas said. "Maybe this is your way of getting back at me, refusing a sale just to spite me." "You damaged my reputation and cost me substantial income," Diego acknowledged. "But this isn't about spite. This is about my business future. The stallion isn't for sale because he's worth more to me as foundation stock than any amount of money you could offer." Thomas left without another word, but Diego knew he'd return. Men like Thomas Whitfield didn't accept being denied things they wanted. And Diego had made certain that Thomas would want the Andalusian stallion more than anything else that might be available to him. Over the next month, Thomas made 3 more attempts to purchase the horse, each time raising his offer. $3,000, $4,000, finally $5,000, and some that represented genuine fortune and would have made Diego wealthy beyond anything he could achieve through normal horse trading. Diego refused every offer with the same explanation. The stallion wasn't for sale because its value in breeding exceeded any purchase price. Thomas's frustration grew with each refusal, visible in the way his jaw tightened and his voice became clipped when discussing the matter. Finally, in late May, Diego made his move. He appeared at the Whitfield Ranch unannounced, riding the Andalusian stallion. Thomas came out onto the porch, surprise and interest warring on his face. "I've reconsidered your situation," Diego said from the saddle. "And I've decided that perhaps we can reach an arrangement after all. You'll sell?" Thomas descended the porch steps, unable to hide his eagerness. "Not exactly. I'm proposing a trade." Diego dismounted, standing beside the magnificent animal. "You have something I need, and I have something you want. I think we can help each other." "What could I possibly have that you need?" Thomas asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Household management," Diego replied. "I'm planning to expand my operation significantly. I'll need someone who can keep accounts, manage correspondence, handle the business side while I focus on acquiring and training stock. Someone educated, capable with numbers and writing. Someone who understands how to run a proper household." Thomas's confusion deepened. "You need a clerk?" "I can recommend several men in Bakersfield who—" "I need someone more skilled than a simple clerk. Someone with real education. Someone who can represent the business professionally." Diego paused, letting Thomas work through the implications. "I need someone like your daughter." The silence that followed was profound. Thomas's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning comprehension, and then something harder to read. Calculation, perhaps, or terrible temptation. "Are you suggesting—" Thomas began. "I'm suggesting a trade," Diego interrupted. "You transfer custody of Catherine to me, along with her full cooperation in managing my household and business affairs. In exchange, I give you the Andalusian stallion, complete bloodline documentation, and full breeding rights." Diego kept his voice neutral, as if proposing a standard business transaction. "Your daughter isn't happy here. You've made that clear through your public complaints about her situation. I'm offering her an opportunity to do useful work, and I'm offering you an asset worth substantially more than the dowry you'd never recover through her marriage. Everyone benefits." "You're insane," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm practical," Diego corrected. "You view your daughter as a burden that offers no return on your investment in her upbringing. I view her as someone with valuable skills that my business needs. That's not insane. That's seeing value where others see problems. Thomas turned away, walking several steps toward his house before stopping. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Even if I considered such an arrangement, which I'm not saying I am, it would be legally complicated. You can't simply trade a person like property. Actually, Diego said, with proper documentation and willing consent from all parties, custody can be transferred. I've already consulted with an attorney in San Francisco who specializes in unusual contracts. The paperwork is complex, but it's feasible, and your daughter would have to consent freely, which means this only works if she chooses to accept the arrangement. Catherine would never agree to this. Maybe you should ask her, Diego suggested. Because from what I've learned about her situation, living isolated in your house is a constant embarrassment. I think she might prefer an alternative where her skills are valued and she has actual purpose. Thomas stood silent for a long moment, staring at the Andalusian stallion. Finally, he spoke. If I were to consider this, and I'm only speaking hypothetically, what guarantee do I have about her treatment? I may be frustrated with Catherine's situation, but she's still my daughter. The arrangement would be employment, not ownership, Diego replied. She'd manage my household and business affairs. Nothing more. She'd have her own quarters, appropriate salary, and complete autonomy in her work. I'm not interested in anything beyond her professional capabilities. What I need is business management. What you need is that horse. What Catherine needs is escape from this house. That's the entire arrangement. Thomas walked back to where Diego stood. Give me time to think about this. Take all the time you need, Diego said, remounting the Andalusian. But understand that this offer isn't indefinite. I have other options for household management, and you have no other way to acquire this animal. The opportunity exists now, but it won't last forever. Diego rode away, leaving Thomas Whitfield standing in his yard, watching the magnificent stallion disappear down the long drive that led from the ranch house to the county road. And Diego knew with absolute certainty that Thomas would convince himself to accept the trade. Not because he was cruel, though he certainly was that, but because Diego had offered him a way to transform a liability into an asset. And men like Thomas Whitfield couldn't resist that kind of transaction, even when it meant sacrificing everything decent human beings were supposed to value. Catherine Rose Whitfield learned about Diego Cortez's proposal in the worst possible way. Not from her father directly, but from overhearing a conversation between her parents that she was never meant to witness. It was late May, nearly midnight, and Catherine had come downstairs to the library seeking a book that might help her sleep through another night of California heat that made her bedroom feel like an oven. The library was on the ground floor, accessible through the main hallway, and as Catherine descended the stairs, she heard voices from her father's study. The door was slightly ajar, lamplight spilling into the darkened hall. She should have announced her presence, should have made noise, cleared her throat, done something to alert them she was there. Instead, Catherine stopped on the stairs, frozen by the sound of her own name spoken in her father's voice with a tone she'd never heard before. Something between disgust and desperate hope. The Mexican is offering me a solution to the Catherine problem, Thomas was saying, and the more I consider it, the more sense it makes. Abigail's response was sharp. You cannot be seriously considering what he proposed. It's unconscionable. She's our daughter, Thomas, our only surviving child. Our only surviving child who has become a millstone around this family's neck, Thomas replied. Be honest, Abigail. When was the last time Catherine contributed anything to this household beyond embarrassment? When was the last time we could take her anywhere without dealing with stares and whispers? She's 23 years old, weighs over 300 pounds, and has zero prospects for marriage or usefulness. Cortez is offering to take that burden off our hands and give us something of actual value in return. Catherine's hand went to her mouth, pressing hard to keep any sound from escaping. She knew her father was disappointed in her, knew he found her size shameful, but hearing it stated so baldly like she was livestock being evaluated for slaughter, made something crack inside her chest. He's offering you a horse, Thomas, in exchange for our daughter. He's offering me an Andalusian stallion worth $6,000 with bloodlines that would make us the most prominent breeding operation in Kern County. And he's offering Catherine an opportunity to actually do something useful instead of hiding in her room. eating herself into an early grave. Thomas's voice carried the rehearsed quality of someone who'd been working through justifications for days. She has skills, Abigail. That expensive San Francisco education we paid for gave her accounting abilities, correspondence skills, household management knowledge. Cortez needs exactly those capabilities for his expanding business. Catherine would be working, not wasting away. That's better than what she has here. And if she refuses, you can't force her to agree to this. I won't have to force her, Thomas said, and Catherine heard the cold certainty in his voice. I'll present it as an option. Explain that she can either continue living here as she is, a burden we tolerate out of obligation, or she can accept Cortez's offer and have actual purpose. Catherine isn't stupid. She'll understand which choice gives her more dignity. The conversation continued, but Catherine had heard enough. She climbed back upstairs in darkness, each step requiring conscious effort, and locked herself in her bedroom. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by her window watching the stars wheel slowly across the California sky, thinking about her life with a clarity that years of isolation had denied her. Her father was right about some things. She had been hiding, had been consuming food as her only comfort in a household where she was tolerated but not valued, had been waiting passively for something to change while knowing nothing would change unless she made it change. The weight that imprisoned her physically was also imprisoning her mentally, and she'd allowed it to happen because fighting it had seemed impossibly difficult. But her father was wrong about other things. She wasn't useless, wasn't stupid, wasn't incapable of work or contribution. She'd simply never been given opportunity to demonstrate those capabilities because her father's world only valued women for their marriageability and social presentation. Catherine had been reading everything she could find about business and accounting for years, teaching herself skills that had no outlet in the Whitfield household, but that represented genuine expertise if anyone cared to utilize them. Diego Cortez's proposal, as absolutely insane as it was, offered something her current situation never would: agency, the chance to use her education and intelligence for actual work. Escape from a house where every day reminded her that she was a disappointment to people who'd stopped loving her years ago. The proposal was also, Catherine understood with sudden sharp insight, revenge. Diego Cortez hadn't orchestrated this arrangement because he genuinely needed household management. He'd engineered it to humiliate Thomas Whitfield by forcing him to trade away his only child for a horse, then making that child more successful and valued than she'd ever been under her father's roof. The revenge was elegant and multifaceted. It punished Thomas for his business sabotage and personal insults, but it also exposed Thomas's fundamental failure as a father by demonstrating that his rejected daughter could thrive once removed from his control. Catherine recognized she was being used as an instrument of someone else's vengeance, but she also recognized that sometimes being someone's weapon was better than being no one's anything. 3 days after overhearing her parents' conversation, Thomas finally approached Catherine directly. He found her in the library, which had become her primary refuge within the house. She was reading a book about agricultural economics, making notes in a ledger she kept for her own interest, tracking wheat prices and cattle markets across California with the precision of someone who had nothing else to occupy her analytical mind. Catherine, I need to discuss something with you. Thomas closed the library door, a gesture that signaled the conversation would be significant, something that might change your circumstances considerably. You want to trade me to Diego Cortez for his Andalusian stallion? Catherine kept her eyes on her ledger as she spoke. In exchange, I would manage his household and business affairs. You've been considering this for several days, trying to decide how to present it in a way that makes you sound less monstrous than the actual transaction implies. The silence that followed was profound. When Catherine finally looked up, her father's face showed genuine shock. You heard us talking. I hear many things, Father. Being invisible has certain advantages. Catherine closed her ledger carefully. The question isn't whether I know about the proposal. The question is what you expect me to do about it. Thomas recovered his composure with visible effort. I expect you to consider it rationally. Your situation here is untenable. You know that as well as I do. Cortez is offering you an opportunity to have actual purpose, to use your education for something beyond reading in isolation. That's more than your current circumstances provide. He's offering you a magnificent horse that will make you the envy of Kern County, Catherine corrected. What he's offering me is a chance to help him destroy your reputation by proving that your useless daughter isn't actually useless at all. You understand this is revenge, don't you? This entire arrangement is Diego Cortez's way of punishing you for destroying his business and insulting him. I understand his motivations perfectly well, Thomas said, irritation creeping into his voice. That doesn't change the practical reality. You're 23 years old with no marriage prospects and no purpose in this household. I'm offering you an alternative that gives you both. You're offering to trade me like livestock. I'm offering you a choice. Thomas's voice hardened. You can stay here, living exactly as you have been, growing older and more isolated while consuming resources and offering nothing in return. Or you can accept Cortez's arrangement, do work that actually matters, and build something for yourself. Those are your options, Catherine. Choose. Catherine looked at her father for a long moment, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time in years. He wasn't a monster, not exactly. He was something worse in some ways. He was a pragmatic man who'd convinced himself that cruelty was simply rational resource management. He genuinely believed he was offering her an opportunity, because he couldn't comprehend that a daughter might want her father's love more than her father's economic calculation of her worth. I'll meet with Diego Cortez, Catherine said finally. I'll hear his proposal directly, and then I'll make my decision. But understand something, Father. If I accept this arrangement, I'm not doing it because you want me to. I'm doing it because you've made it clear that I have no future in this house, and I'd rather be useful to someone who values my work than burdensome to someone who resents my existence. Thomas's face tightened, but he nodded. Cortez will be here tomorrow afternoon. You'll speak with him privately, and whatever you decide, the conversation stays confidential. I won't have the situation becoming public gossip before we've reached a final agreement. Diego Cortez arrived at the Whitfield Ranch at 2 o'clock the following afternoon, riding the Andalusian stallion. Catherine watched from her bedroom window as he dismounted and spoke briefly with her father on the porch. Then Thomas led Diego inside, and 5 minutes later, a servant knocked on Catherine's door with a message that Mr. Cortez was waiting in the library to speak with her. Catherine descended the stairs slowly, conscious of her size and the effort required to move with any semblance of grace. When she entered the library, Diego stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the Whitfield Ranch's vast holdings. He turned as she entered, and Catherine saw his face register her appearance without the poorly concealed shock or pity she was accustomed to seeing in new acquaintances. Miss Whitfield, Diego said, offering a slight bow. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Mr. Cortez. Catherine moved to a chair that could accommodate her size, something she'd learned to identify quickly in any room. I understand you've made my father a proposal that involves trading his daughter for your horse. I'd like to hear the terms directly from you without my father's interpretation. Diego took a seat across from her, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp and assessing. Your father damaged my business through lies and social pressure. I've spent 18 months planning appropriate response. The arrangement I'm proposing accomplishes several goals simultaneously. It gives him something he values while taking away something he's discarded. It gives you an opportunity to escape a situation that's clearly making you miserable. And it gives me the satisfaction of proving that what your father considered worthless actually has substantial value. You're using me as a weapon against my father. Yes, Diego said simply. But that doesn't mean the opportunity I'm offering isn't genuine. I do need household and business management. I am expanding my operations. And you do have skills that would be valuable to me. The fact that all of this also serves my revenge doesn't diminish the practical reality of what I'm proposing. Catherine studied him for a long moment. Why should I trust that you'll treat me decently? You're offering to take custody of me. That's language that implies ownership, not employment. The custody language is legal necessity to make the documentation work, Diego replied. In practice, you'd be my business manager and household administrator. You'd have your own quarters, set your own schedule, manage the business side of my operations with full authority. I'd handle horse acquisition and training. You'd handle everything else. That's a genuine partnership, Miss Whitfield. Your father treats you like a burden. I'd be treating you like the educated, capable person you actually are. And if I refuse, if I tell my father I won't agree to this arrangement, then I keep my horse and your situation continues exactly as it is. Diego's voice was matter of fact. Your father might find other ways to try to force you out of his house, but that's between you and him. My offer is genuine, but it's not coercion. You need to choose this freely, or it doesn't work for any of us. Catherine felt something loosen in her chest, some tension she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. I'll agree to your arrangement, Mr. Cortez. Not because my father wants me to, and not because I'm desperate, though I suppose I am that. I'll agree because you're offering me something no one else in my life has offered in 5 years. A chance to be useful, to have my skills matter, to build something instead of just hiding and waiting to die. She leaned forward slightly. But understand something. I know this is revenge. I know you're using me to hurt my father. And I'm choosing to be that weapon because he deserves it. He spent years treating me like a shameful secret, and I'm done protecting his feelings about his failure as a father. If my success in your household embarrasses him, good. He's earned that embarrassment. Diego's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been respect appearing in his eyes. Then we understand each other perfectly, Miss Whitfield. I'll have the legal documents prepared. Your father and I will need to negotiate the specific terms, but the foundation is agreed. You'll manage my household and business operations. I'll provide appropriate compensation, quarters, and professional respect. And together, we'll prove that your father's greatest mistake was failing to recognize your value. The legal documents required 3 weeks to prepare properly. Diego had hired an attorney from San Francisco, a man named Edmund Castleberry, who specialized in unusual contracts and had connections throughout California's legal community. Castleberry arrived in Bakersfield in mid-June with paperwork that was simultaneously precise and deliberately vague in ways that made the arrangement legally defensible while obscuring its more troubling implications. The core document was a custody transfer agreement. Thomas Whitfield agreed to dissolve his parental authority over Catherine Rose Whitfield and transfer legal responsibility for her welfare to Diego Mateo Cortez. In exchange, Cortez would transfer ownership of one Andalusian stallion, including full bloodline documentation and breeding rights, to Whitfield. Both parties acknowledged receiving valuable consideration. A secondary document, signed only by Catherine, stated her free consent to the arrangement and her voluntary acceptance of Cortez's custody and authority. The language carefully avoided specific terms about employment or compensation, instead using phrases like household participation and business collaboration that could mean almost anything. A third document, known only to Catherine and Diego, outlined the actual terms of their working relationship. Catherine would serve as business manager with full authority over accounts, correspondence, property management, and commercial negotiations. She would receive 20% of net profits from Diego's operations, payable quarterly. She would have complete autonomy in her work and private quarters that Diego would not enter without explicit invitation. The arrangement was employment dressed in custody language, but the employment terms were more generous than most women in 1871 California could hope to achieve through any conventional path. The transaction was scheduled for June 7, 1871, to take place at the Whitfield Ranch with witnesses present to make the exchange legally binding. Thomas insisted on multiple witnesses, wanting the arrangement documented thoroughly to prevent any future challenges. Diego agreed, understanding that more witnesses meant more people who would eventually gossip about what Thomas Whitfield had done, spreading the story throughout Kern County in ways that would permanently taint Thomas's reputation. The morning of June 7th arrived clear and brutally hot, temperature already climbing past 90 degrees by 9 in the morning. Catherine spent those morning hours packing her possessions into 3 trunks, a process that felt simultaneously momentous and mundane. Clothes, mostly practical dresses that accommodated her size. Books, dozens of them accumulated over years of reading as her primary escape. The ledgers where she'd practiced accounting and business analysis. Personal items that represented her entire life condensed into containers that could be loaded into a wagon. Abigail appeared in Catherine's doorway as she was closing the last trunk. Her mother's face showed emotions that Catherine couldn't quite parse. Grief, perhaps, or guilt, or simply exhaustion from years of dealing with a daughter who'd become an unsolvable problem. "You don't have to do this," Abigail said quietly. "You can refuse. Your father will be angry, but he can't actually force you to go through with this arrangement." "Yes, I do have to do this," Catherine replied, not looking at her mother. "Because if I stay here, I'll die. Maybe not physically, though probably that too eventually. But everything in me that matters will die from being useless and unwanted." Mr. Cortez is offering me an opportunity to matter to someone. That's more than this house has offered me in 5 years. Catherine, Abigail began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words that could bridge the distance that had grown between them. I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope so too, Catherine said. Then, relenting slightly because her mother had at least tried to protest, she added, Thank you for not fighting harder to keep me here. I know that sounds terrible, but it's true. Fighting to stay would have been worse than leaving. At 2 o'clock, Diego Cortez arrived with his attorney and Peter Sullivan, the young stable hand who worked for Diego occasionally. Thomas had assembled his own witnesses, 7 men in total, ranch managers, business associates, and his own attorney from Bakersfield. The men gathered under the massive oak tree that shaded the Whitfield ranch house's front yard, everyone acutely aware they were participating in something extraordinary and deeply uncomfortable. Diego dismounted from the Andalusian stallion, and every man present took a moment to appreciate the animal's magnificence. The horse stood perfectly still, its silver-gray coat gleaming in the afternoon sun, its bearing suggesting aristocratic bloodlines that went back centuries. This wasn't just a horse. This was a statement about wealth, taste, and connections to California's Spanish colonial past. Owning this animal would elevate Thomas Whitfield's status significantly, and everyone present understood that calculation. Catherine emerged from the house wearing a dark green traveling dress, one of the few formal garments that fit her properly. She walked down the porch steps carefully, conscious of the men's eyes on her, and took her position beside Diego. Her face showed nothing. No fear, no shame, no uncertainty, just a kind of determined neutrality that came from having made a decision and committed to seeing it through. Edmund Castleberry produced the documents and spread them on a small table that had been brought from the house. He explained the terms in careful legal language that made the transaction sound almost normal, just property transfer and custody arrangement and mutual acknowledgement of valuable consideration. The words obscured what was really happening. A father trading his daughter for a horse. A woman choosing exile over continued imprisonment in her family home. A Mexican immigrant executing perfect revenge by forcing a powerful Anglo rancher to publicly admit his daughter was worth exactly 1 animal. Thomas signed first, his hand steady, his expression showing nothing. Diego signed second, adding his signature with the same calm precision. Then Catherine signed the final document, the one that acknowledged her consent to everything that was about to happen. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote her name, the only visible indication of the enormity of what she was doing. Witnessed and acknowledged, Castleberry announced. The custody transfer is legally complete. Miss Whitfield is now under the authority and protection of Mr. Diego Cortez. The Andalusian stallion is now the property of Mr. Thomas Whitfield, with full bloodline documentation and breeding rights transferred. He paused. Gentlemen, you've witnessed a legal transaction. I encourage you to remember it as such, and to speak of it carefully if you speak of it at all. The warning was unnecessary. Everyone present understood that what they'd witnessed would haunt them. Some would tell the story eventually, unable to resist sharing something so extraordinary. Others would keep silent, wanting no association with what had occurred. But all of them would remember standing under that oak tree in June 1871, watching a father trade his daughter for a horse while the daughter signed documents agreeing to her own transfer. Diego helped Catherine into the wagon he'd brought for her trunks. Thomas took possession of the Andalusian stallion, running his hands over the animal's neck with a satisfaction that made several witnesses look away in disgust. The exchange was complete. Everyone had received what they'd agreed to, and as Diego drove the wagon down the long road away from the Whitfield ranch with Catherine sitting beside him in silence, the 7 witnesses stood under the oak tree, trying to process what they'd just participated in, and failing to find words adequate to the moment. Peter Sullivan, riding behind the wagon on his own horse, would later tell people that Catherine had looked back once at the ranch house where she'd spent her entire life. Just once briefly, then she'd turned forward and hadn't looked back again. The 20-mile journey from the Whitfield ranch to Diego's property in Bakersfield took nearly 4 hours on roads that varied from maintained wagon tracks to barely visible trails through grassland. Catherine sat beside Diego in the wagon, neither of them speaking for the first hour. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, more like the stillness that follows an earthquake when everyone is assessing damage and trying to determine what remains standing. Finally, Diego spoke. You understand that people will talk. The witnesses will spread the story, and most versions won't be kind to either of us. I understand, Catherine replied. They'll call me the woman who got traded for a horse. They'll call you the Mexican who took advantage of a desperate situation. Neither characterization will be completely wrong. But neither will be completely right either, Diego said. What we actually are is two people who needed what the other could provide, and who were willing to ignore social conventions to make that exchange. That's more complicated than people want to admit. Mr. Cortez, Catherine said carefully, I need to understand something before we arrive at your property. The custody language in those documents gives you legal authority over me in ways that could be abused. I agreed to this arrangement because you promised it would be employment, not ownership. But I need to hear you confirm that promise again, now that the papers are signed and I've left my father's house. Because if you're planning something different than what you described, I need to know now. Diego pulled the wagon to a stop beside the road, turning to look at Catherine directly. I need business management and household administration. That's the truth. I'm not interested in anything else from you. Not companionship. Not anything improper. Nothing beyond your professional capabilities. The revenge I'm executing against your father works only if you succeed in my household, proving that he discarded something valuable. That requires you to actually be valued and to thrive. Abusing the power those documents give me would undermine everything I'm trying to accomplish. He paused. You're an employee, Miss Whitfield. A well-compensated employee with significant authority. The custody language is legal fiction to make the transaction work. Nothing more. Catherine studied his face, looking for deception and finding none. Then we understand each other, Mr. Cortez. I'll manage your business and household with every skill I possess, and you'll respect the boundaries we've established. If that arrangement breaks down, I'll find ways to destroy you that will make whatever revenge you're planning against my father look gentle by comparison. Diego smiled slightly. I believe you, Miss Whitfield, and I respect the threat. Now shall we continue to Bakersfield? You have a business to start managing, and I have considerable work to do, making you into the weapon that destroys your father's reputation. They arrived at Diego's property as the sun was beginning its descent toward the coast range, painting the western sky in shades of orange and gold. The property was modest compared to the Whitfield ranch. 5 acres on the eastern edge of Bakersfield, with a small house, a well-maintained barn, and several corrals. But it was organized efficiently, and Catherine could see immediately that it was a working operation rather than a display of wealth. Peter Sullivan had ridden ahead and was waiting with a woman Catherine hadn't expected to see. She was perhaps 50 years old, Mexican, with gray-streaked black hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd survived considerable hardship and emerged stronger for it. Miss Whitfield, Diego said, helping Catherine down from the wagon. This is Senora Carmen Flores. She manages the household cooking and cleaning, and she'll help you get settled. Senora Flores, this is Catherine Whitfield. She'll be managing the business operations and overseeing household administration from now on. Carmen assessed Catherine with sharp eyes, her expression neutral. Welcome, Miss Whitfield. Your rooms are prepared. I'll show you where everything is, and then you can rest from the journey. Tomorrow will be soon enough to discuss how we'll work together. The practicality of the greeting, the absence of judgment or excessive curiosity, made something in Catherine relax slightly. She followed Carmen into the house, leaving Diego and Peter to handle her trunks. The house interior was simple but clean, with furniture that was functional rather than decorative. Carmen led her to a bedroom on the ground floor, spacious and cool with windows that provided cross-ventilation. Mr. Cortez had me prepare this room for you, Carmen explained. It's the largest bedroom in the house. His own room is upstairs, and there's an office space up there as well. You'll want to see that tomorrow when you start working. For tonight, I'll bring you dinner, and you should sleep. Tomorrow you can begin figuring out how to manage this place properly, because Diego Cortez is very good with horses and very terrible with paperwork. Catherine couldn't help a small smile at the blunt assessment. Senora Flores, can I ask you a question? Of course. You know what happened today. You know about the arrangement Mr. Cortez made with my father. I know, Carmen confirmed.
Everyone in Bakersfield's Mexican community knows. Diego has been planning this for a year. Does it bother you? Does it seem wrong? Carmen considered the question seriously. What seems wrong is a father who would trade his daughter for a horse.
What Diego did, making that father actually go through with such a trade to prove his cruelty. That seems like justice. As for you, Miss Whitfield, you're here now. What matters is what you make of the situation. Are you going to hide in this room like you hid in your father's house? Or are you going to do the work Diego needs done and prove that you're worth more than your father ever recognized? The question hung in the air between them, more challenge than inquiry. Catherine straightened her shoulders, feeling something shift inside her. Something that had been dormant for years finally stirring back to life. I'm going to work, Senora Flores. I'm going to manage Mr. Cortez's business better than it's ever been managed. And I'm going to make sure every person in Kern County knows that Thomas Whitfield's useless daughter is extraordinary at everything her father claimed she couldn't do. Carmen smiled for the first time. Good, then we'll get along perfectly. Now rest tonight, and tomorrow we begin. Catherine Rose Whitfield's first morning in Diego Cortez's household began at 5:30. Not because anyone woke her, but because she'd barely slept. The unfamiliar sounds of Bakersfield at dawn. Horses, moving in corrals, men's voices speaking Spanish in the barn, the clatter of Carmen preparing breakfast in the kitchen. All of it pulled her from the half-sleep she'd managed. She rose, dressed in one of her practical work dresses, and emerged from her room to find Diego already at the kitchen table with coffee and what appeared to be several months of unorganized business correspondence spread before him. Miss Whitfield, he said, looking up. I didn't expect you to start work immediately. You're entitled to settling in time. I'm entitled to exactly what our agreement specifies, Catherine replied, which is managing your business operations. So let's start. Show me what you have. For records, and let's assess how deep the organizational disaster goes. What Catherine discovered over the next 3 hours was both worse and better than she'd anticipated. Diego's actual horse trading business was sound. He had an excellent eye for quality animals, maintained detailed mental records of bloodlines and training progress, and had built a network of buyers and sellers throughout California and into neighboring territories. The problem was that almost none of this existed on paper. Diego conducted his business largely through memory, handshake agreements, and informal arrangements that worked perfectly until they didn't. He had invoices from suppliers mixed with personal correspondence, breeding records scrawled on random pieces of paper, and financial accounts that existed across 3 different ledgers with no clear system for which transactions went where. This is chaos, Catherine said, surveying the disaster. How have you managed to stay profitable? I remember everything, Diego replied. I know which horses I've bought, which I've sold, what I paid, what I received. I know my suppliers' prices and my customers' preferences. It's all in here. He tapped his temple. And what happens when you're thrown from a horse and forget everything? Or when someone disputes a transaction and you have no documentation? Or when you need to secure a loan and can't provide organized accounts to demonstrate creditworthiness? Catherine was already organizing papers into rough categories. Mr. Cortez, you're operating like a man with a dozen horses, not someone trying to build a serious breeding operation. If you want to expand, you need systems that can scale beyond what one person can hold in their memory. Diego watched her work, and for the first time since the courthouse transaction, something like doubt crossed his face. You're telling me I've been doing this wrong for 5 years. I'm telling you that you're excellent at the parts you care about and terrible at the parts you don't, Catherine said, which is exactly why you need me. Now, let's establish some basic systems before this gets any worse. What followed was 3 weeks of intensive organization that transformed Diego's operation from informal one-man trading into something resembling an actual business. Catherine created a master ledger that tracked all financial transactions with standardized categories. She established separate accounts for different aspects of the operation: horse purchases, training expenses, feed and supplies, property maintenance, sales revenue. She created a filing system for correspondence that made it possible to find any letter or document within minutes rather than hours. She reviewed every outstanding agreement Diego had made, documented the terms properly, and created a calendar system that tracked when payments were due, or when horses would be delivered. The work consumed her completely. Catherine would rise. Before dawn, spend the morning on accounts and correspondence, break for a quick lunch, then spend afternoons reviewing Diego's upcoming business plans and identifying potential problems or opportunities. She took her evening meal at her desk more often than not, continuing to work until her vision blurred and Carmen would insist she needed sleep. For the first time in 5 years, Catherine's mind was fully engaged. She wasn't hiding or waiting or consuming food as her only comfort. She was building something, solving problems, using the education her father had paid for but never valued. And she was good at it. Better than good. Catherine discovered she had a natural talent for business administration that had been completely wasted during her years at the Whitfield Ranch. She could see patterns in financial data that Diego had missed, could identify suppliers who were overcharging or customers who were consistently late with payments, could negotiate better terms on purchases because she researched market rates and refused to accept inflated prices. Within a month, Catherine had reduced Diego's supply costs by 18% and increased his average sale price by 12%, simply by implementing better purchasing strategies and more professional sales presentations. She'd collected on 3 outstanding debts that Diego had written off as uncollectible, totaling nearly $400. She'd identified a breeding opportunity with a ranch in Los Angeles that could generate substantial income if properly structured. Diego watched this transformation with something approaching awe. "Your father is an idiot," he said one evening, as Catherine presented him with the month's financial summary. "You're making me more money in 4 weeks than I typically clear in 3 months, and we haven't even begun the expansion plans." "My father sees value only in things that enhance his social standing," Catherine replied. "Capability doesn't matter to him if it comes in a package that embarrasses him. But his blindness is your advantage, Mr. Cortez, and mine as well." Because something else was happening alongside the business transformation. Catherine herself was changing in ways that went beyond organizational skill. The constant work, the physical activity of moving around the property rather than sitting in isolation, the regular meals that Carmen prepared with appropriate portions, rather than the excessive quantities Catherine had been consuming out of boredom and misery, all of it was affecting her physically. She was losing weight. Not dramatically, not in ways that anyone would notice week to week. But by the end of her 2nd month in Bakersfield, Catherine's clothes were fitting differently. She had more energy, could move with less effort, found herself sleeping better and waking more refreshed. More significantly, Catherine was discovering that being valued for her work was rebuilding something inside her that years of her father's contempt had broken. She wasn't just managing Diego's business. She was proving to herself that she was capable, intelligent, worthy of respect. That her father had been wrong about her fundamental value. That what he'd discarded as worthless was actually extraordinary when given proper opportunity. Diego noticed the changes and was careful to acknowledge them appropriately. He praised her work specifically, pointing out clever solutions or particularly effective negotiations. He deferred to her judgment on business decisions that fell within her expertise. He treated her as a genuine partner rather than an employee, asking her opinion on strategic questions and incorporating her feedback into his planning. It was professional respect of the kind Catherine had never experienced, and it was transformative in ways that went beyond simple confidence building. By October 1871, 4 months after the courthouse transaction, Diego's operation had changed fundamentally. He'd purchased 2 additional breeding mares using capital that Catherine's improved financial management had made available. He'd secured contracts with 3 new buyers in Sacramento and 2 in San Francisco, relationships that Catherine had initiated through carefully crafted correspondence. He'd established a formal partnership with a trainer in Monterey who could help place their horses with wealthy buyers throughout California's coastal communities. The business was no longer just Diego buying and selling horses. It was becoming a genuine breeding and training operation with multiple revenue streams and expansion potential that could make Diego wealthy within a few years, and people were noticing. Word spread through Bakersfield's business community that Diego Cortez had hired someone to manage his operations, and that whoever this person was had transformed his business dramatically. Some of those inquiries led back to Catherine, and when they did, the reactions were mixed. Surprise that a woman was handling complex business affairs. Greater surprise that Thomas Whitfield's daughter, the one everyone had heard about, the unmarriageable girl who disappeared from Kern County society, was not only competent, but apparently exceptional at commercial management. The gossip reached Thomas Whitfield by early November, carried by business associates who thought he'd be pleased to hear his daughter was doing well. Instead, Thomas's reaction was a complicated mixture of emotions he couldn't quite process. Pride that Catherine was demonstrating Whitfield family intelligence. Frustration that those abilities were now benefiting Diego Cortez rather than his own family. And growing unease that the transaction he'd made, which had seemed so advantageous at the time, was starting to look like a profound miscalculation. The Andalusian stallion had proven everything Diego had promised. The horse's breeding produced foals of extraordinary quality, and Thomas had already sold 2 for prices that exceeded his investment in their dam and all training costs combined. The stallion was making Thomas Whitfield money and enhancing his reputation as a serious horse breeder. But every conversation about the magnificent Andalusian eventually led to questions about where Thomas had acquired such an animal. And those questions, when answered honestly, required admitting to the courthouse transaction. Thomas could lie, and often did, claiming he'd purchased the stallion through normal channels. But too many people had witnessed the actual exchange, and their versions of the story were circulating throughout Kern County in forms that made Thomas look increasingly terrible. The story people were telling in late 1871 wasn't about a practical business arrangement between 2 men. It was about a father who'd valued a horse more than his daughter. About a man so embarrassed by his child's appearance that he'd traded her away to save face. About Thomas Whitfield's fundamental cruelty being exposed through a transaction he'd foolishly agreed to document with witnesses and legal paperwork. And the story was only getting worse because Catherine was thriving. Every report of her business success, every account of Diego Cortez's expanding operations, every mention of the capable woman managing one of Bakersfield's most promising commercial ventures, all of it reinforced that Thomas had discarded something valuable because he'd been too blind to recognize quality that didn't come in the package he expected. Diego understood this perfectly and began making subtle moves to amplify Thomas's growing discomfort. In December, he arranged for Catherine to attend a horse auction in Bakersfield as his official representative, authorizing her to bid on specific animals they'd identified as valuable breeding stock. Catherine's appearance at the auction created immediate stir. This was Thomas Whitfield's daughter, the one everyone had heard had been traded away, now conducting business on behalf of the Mexican horse trader who'd orchestrated that trade. She bid confidently, purchased 2 mares for excellent prices, and conducted herself with professional competence that made several ranchers reconsider their assumptions about women's capability in commercial affairs. Thomas was not present at that auction, but reports reached him within hours, and his reaction was explosive. He appeared at Diego's property 2 days later, riding the Andalusian stallion, his face tight with barely controlled rage. Catherine was working in the small office space that Diego had established for her near the house's main room. She heard raised voices outside and emerged to find her father confronting Diego in the yard. "You're parading her around Bakersfield deliberately," Thomas was saying, "using her to embarrass me and undermine my reputation. That wasn't part of our agreement. Our agreement was that I would take custody of Catherine and employ her in managing my business affairs," Diego replied calmly. "Which is exactly what I'm doing. If your daughter's competence embarrasses you, that speaks to your judgment, not mine. She's making a spectacle of herself, acting like some kind of business agent when she should be managing household affairs privately." "She's managing my business affairs exactly as our contract specified," Diego said. "And she's doing it brilliantly. If that bothers you, Mr. Whitfield, perhaps you should have recognized her value before trading her away." Catherine stepped forward before her father could respond. "I'm right here, Father. If you have complaints about my conduct, address them to me directly instead of discussing me like I'm still your property." Thomas turned to face his daughter, and Catherine saw shock register on his face. She'd lost nearly 40 pounds since June, and while she was still substantially overweight, the change was visible. More significant was the transformation in how she carried herself. The defeated, hunched posture Thomas remembered had been replaced by something approaching confidence. "You look different." Thomas said, the observation escaping before he could stop it. I'm different, Catherine replied. I'm doing work that matters to someone who values my capabilities. That tends to change a person. Now, was there something specific you needed? Or did you come here just to complain that your daughter is succeeding in ways you never imagined she could? The confrontation lasted another 5 minutes, with Thomas alternating between accusations that Diego was exploiting Catherine and demands that the arrangement be modified to keep Catherine out of public view. Diego refused every demand, and Catherine supported him completely, making clear that she was thriving in her current situation and had no intention of accepting her father's belated concerns about her welfare. Finally, Thomas rode away on the Andalusian stallion, his back rigid with fury. Diego and Catherine stood in the yard, watching him disappear down the road toward his ranch. He's going to cause problems, Diego observed. Real problems, not just complaints. He can't tolerate that this arrangement is working exactly as I planned. Let him try, Catherine said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. I spent 23 years trying to please that man and never succeeding. I'm done caring what he thinks or wants. If he creates problems, we'll handle them, together. What? Neither of them anticipated was how far Thomas Whitfield would go to restore his damaged reputation and reverse the transaction that was making him a source of gossip throughout Kern County. The first indication came in early January 1872, when Catherine received a letter from her mother. The letter was brief and carefully worded, clearly written with the understanding that Thomas might read it. But between the formal phrases, Abigail's meaning was clear enough. Thomas was consulting with attorneys about challenging the custody arrangement on the grounds that Catherine had been coerced into signing the documents. He was gathering testimony from people who'd witnessed her condition during her final years at the Whitfield Ranch, planning to argue that she'd been in no mental state to consent freely to such an extraordinary agreement. Catherine brought the letter to Diego immediately. He's going to try to invalidate the contract. Claim I was coerced or incompetent when I signed. Diego read the letter carefully, his expression darkening. Edmund Castleberry anticipated this possibility. The documents we created were designed to withstand exactly this kind of challenge, but your father has resources and connections. If he pursues this seriously, we'll face months of legal proceedings even if we ultimately win, which would damage your business through the distraction and damage my reputation by making it seem like I need rescuing from an arrangement I chose freely, Catherine said, anger rising in her chest. He's not doing this because he cares about my welfare. He's doing it because he can't tolerate being proven wrong about my value. Then we need to make his challenge costly enough that he reconsiders, Diego said. Not just legally costly, but socially costly. We need to make it clear that attacking this arrangement will expose him to scrutiny he won't enjoy. What they devised over the next week was a strategy that Catherine initially resisted on moral grounds but eventually accepted as necessary. Catherine would write a detailed letter to Edmund Castleberry, to be held in confidence but available if needed in legal proceedings, describing her treatment during her final years at the Whitfield Ranch. The isolation, her father's open contempt, the humiliation of being weighed on a cattle scale. The letter would establish that her consent to Diego's arrangement hadn't been coerced but had been an escape from genuinely terrible circumstances. It would paint Thomas Whitfield not as a concerned father trying to protect his daughter, but as an abusive parent who'd created conditions so intolerable that his daughter chose exile over remaining in his house. Catherine spent 3 days writing that letter, documenting in precise detail what her life had been like under her father's roof. When she finished, she had 16 pages of testimony that would destroy Thomas Whitfield's reputation as a respectable family man if it ever became public. The letter was simultaneously therapeutic and devastating to write, forcing Catherine to confront memories she'd been suppressing and to acknowledge how profoundly damaged she'd been by her father's treatment. Diego sent the letter to Castleberry with instructions that it should be sealed and preserved, unless legal action forced its disclosure. He also sent a separate communication to Thomas's attorney in Bakersfield, making clear that any challenge to the custody arrangement would result in Catherine's full testimony about her circumstances becoming part of the public record. The message was unambiguous. Thomas could pursue legal action if he wished, but doing so would expose him to humiliation far worse than the gossip currently circulating about the courthouse transaction. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Then in early February, Catherine received a second letter from her mother. Thomas had decided not to pursue legal action. The letter didn't explain why, but the implication was clear. Someone had conveyed the warning about Catherine's potential testimony, and Thomas had decided the risk wasn't worth the potential benefit. He would have to live with the arrangement he'd made and the consequences it was creating for his reputation. The victory felt hollow to Catherine. She'd wanted her father to recognize his mistake, to acknowledge that he'd been wrong about her capabilities and worth. Instead, he'd simply calculated that attacking her would cost him more than tolerating her success. It was pragmatism rather than remorse, calculation rather than conscience. But it was also final. Thomas Whitfield would not challenge the custody arrangement, which meant Catherine's position in Diego's household was secure. She could continue the work she'd begun without fearing forced return to her father's control. By spring of 1872, nearly a year after the courthouse transaction, Diego Cortez's operation had become one of the most successful horse breeding and training businesses in the San Joaquin Valley. Catherine's management had made this possible, but Diego's expertise with animals had provided the foundation. Together, they'd created something that neither could have accomplished alone. The business was generating annual profits that exceeded $10,000. Extraordinary wealth for what had been a struggling one-man trading operation just 12 months earlier. Catherine herself had continued her physical transformation, losing over 60 pounds and regaining mobility and energy she hadn't experienced since her mid-teens. But the more significant transformation was internal. She'd discovered that she possessed business acumen that rivaled anyone in Kern County, regardless of gender. She'd proven that her father's assessment of her worth had been catastrophically wrong, and she'd found purpose and respect in an arrangement that everyone had initially viewed as scandalous exploitation. Diego's revenge on Thomas Whitfield was working exactly as he'd planned. The courthouse transaction had forced Thomas to publicly demonstrate his cruelty, while creating circumstances that allowed Catherine to thrive in ways that made Thomas look increasingly foolish for having discarded her. Every business success Catherine achieved reinforced Thomas's failure as a father. Every report of Diego's expanding operations reminded people that the Mexican horse trader Thomas had tried to destroy was now more successful than many of the established ranchers who'd dismissed him. But revenge, Catherine was learning, was complicated. Yes, her father deserved the humiliation and social damage he was experiencing. Yes, Diego had been justified in orchestrating an arrangement that exposed Thomas's fundamental lack of character. But the cost of that revenge was ongoing discomfort for Catherine herself, who would forever be known as the woman who'd been traded for a horse. Her success couldn't erase that transaction from public memory. It could only complicate how people interpreted it, transforming her from victim into something more ambiguous. An agent of her own liberation, perhaps, but one whose freedom had been purchased through an arrangement that violated every principle of how civilized people were supposed to treat each other. In April 1872, Catherine attended a business function in Bakersfield, a gathering of merchants and ranchers discussing expansion of the town's commercial district. She was there representing Diego's interests, as he was traveling in Nevada pursuing horse acquisitions. During the meeting, Catherine presented a proposal for a formal horse auction venue that would benefit multiple breeders and traders, including Diego's operation. Her presentation was professional and well-reasoned, and several attendees expressed support for the idea. But afterward, as people mingled and discussed the proposals informally, Catherine overheard a conversation that stopped her cold. Two ranchers were standing near the refreshment table, speaking in voices they clearly thought were private. "That's Whitfield's daughter, isn't it? The one he traded for the Andalusian?" "Same one. She's managing Cortez's business now, apparently doing well at it. Still, imagine being known forever as the woman who got traded for a horse. No amount of business success erases that. She'll carry that story to her grave." Catherine stood frozen, the words cutting through her despite knowing they were true. She would carry that story forever, would always be defined by the transaction that had liberated her. The irony was bitter. Her father's cruelty had given her opportunities she'd never have had otherwise, but it had also branded her with a narrative she could never escape. Diego found her 20 minutes later, sitting alone in a side room where coats and hats were stored. "Carmen told me you left the main gathering. What happened?" Catherine told him about the overheard conversation, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. They're right, you know. I'll always be that story, the daughter who was worth one horse. Nothing I accomplish will ever be as interesting to people as the fact that my father traded me away. Diego sat down beside her, silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I orchestrated that transaction as revenge against your father. I wanted to humiliate him by forcing him to publicly demonstrate his cruelty. And it worked. Thomas Whitfield's reputation has been permanently damaged by what he did, but I didn't fully consider what that revenge would cost you. The permanent association with a transaction that diminishes you even as it liberated you. That was thoughtless of me, and I apologize. You gave me the opportunity to escape circumstances that were destroying me, Catherine replied. You've treated me with more respect and provided me more purpose than my father ever did. I chose this arrangement knowing what it would mean. The social cost isn't your fault. It's the price I paid for freedom, and I'd pay it again. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. They sat together in that side room for nearly an hour, discussing the complexities of their arrangement. The way Catherine's success was both vindication and burden. The way Diego's revenge had succeeded while creating complications he hadn't anticipated. The way their professional partnership had evolved into something approaching genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. What happens now? Catherine finally asked. We continue, Diego said simply. We build the business into something even more successful. We prove that what your father discarded was so valuable that losing you cost him more than he'll ever admit. And we accept that people will always talk about the courthouse transaction. But we refuse to let that story be the only story. There's also the story of what you built afterward. That story matters too, Catherine nodded slowly. Then let's make that story as impressive as possible. Let's make my father regret every day for the rest of his life that he was stupid enough to trade me away. By summer of 1872, Diego's operation was ready for its next phase of expansion. Using capital that Catherine's management had accumulated, they purchased an additional 40 acres adjacent to Diego's original property, allowing for significant expansion of breeding and training facilities. They hired 2 additional handlers and began construction on a new barn designed specifically for quality breeding stock. Catherine negotiated a partnership with a feed supplier that would reduce costs while ensuring consistent quality, and Diego secured agreements with buyers in Portland and Seattle, expanding their market beyond California. Thomas Whitfield watched this expansion from a distance, his own operations continuing successfully, but without the dramatic growth Diego was experiencing. The Andalusian stallion remained valuable, but Thomas found that the horse's bloodline association with Diego's operation actually enhanced Diego's reputation more than his own. People who purchased foals from Thomas often commented that the bloodline traced back to Diego Cortez's original stock, inadvertently crediting Diego for quality that Thomas was technically producing. The irony deepened. In August, when Catherine successfully negotiated a sale of 3 yearling colts to a wealthy buyer in San Francisco for nearly $2,000. The transaction was entirely Catherine's work, from identifying the buyer to structuring the terms to arranging delivery. Diego publicly credited her with the success at a Bakersfield business gathering, describing Catherine as the most capable business manager in the San Joaquin Valley. Several people present at that gathering later mentioned it to Thomas Whitfield, wanting to congratulate him on his daughter's success. Thomas's response to these congratulations was reportedly bitter and defensive. His daughter's success, he would say, was benefiting someone else while offering nothing to the family that had paid for her expensive education. He'd made a business decision that had seemed sound at the time, but that circumstances had revealed to be unfortunate. But he never admitted that the decision had been wrong. Never acknowledged that he'd misjudged Catherine's value or capability. Never expressed regret for having treated his only surviving child as disposable property. And that refusal to admit error was costing him in ways that went beyond business competition with Diego Cortez. Thomas Whitfield's standing in Kern County society had suffered permanent damage. People still did business with him, but the social invitations had decreased. The leadership positions in community organizations had gone to others. The respect that Thomas had worked decades to cultivate had been undermined by a single transaction that revealed his character too clearly for even his most sympathetic associates to ignore. By the end of 1872, 18 months after the courthouse transaction, the situation had stabilized into a new configuration that no one had quite anticipated. Diego Cortez had executed successful revenge while building a genuinely impressive business. Catherine Whitfield had escaped her father's control and discovered capabilities she'd never been allowed to develop. Thomas Whitfield had obtained a valuable horse while losing his daughter, his reputation, and his standing in the community he'd worked so hard to join. But the story wasn't finished. Because Thomas Whitfield, despite everything, still couldn't accept what had happened. Couldn't tolerate that his rejected daughter was thriving while his own reputation continued deteriorating. Couldn't live with being proven so thoroughly wrong about something he'd been so certain he'd calculated correctly. And in his inability to accept these outcomes, Thomas was about to make decisions that would transform their conflict from social drama into something far more dangerous. Something that would threaten not just reputations but lives. Something that would require Catherine to make choices about how far she was willing to go to protect the life she'd built from the father who'd tried to discard her. The first indication that Thomas Whitfield's patience had finally shattered came not through direct action, but through absence. In January 1873, nearly 20 months after the courthouse transaction, Thomas stopped appearing at Bakersfield business gatherings entirely. He withdrew from the Agricultural Association, citing pressures of ranch management. He declined invitations to social events he'd previously attended faithfully. People who encountered him in town reported that he seemed distracted, angry, diminished in ways that went beyond simple embarrassment about his social standing. Abigail Whitfield sent Catherine a letter in late January that contained only 3 sentences, but those sentences conveyed profound warning. Your father speaks of you constantly. His mood has become dark in ways that concern me. Please be careful. Catherine showed the letter to Diego, and they discussed increasing security around the property. But neither quite believed Thomas would escalate beyond legal maneuvering and social complaints. They were wrong. The attack came on February 14, 1873, during one of Diego's extended buying trips to Arizona Territory. He'd been gone for 10 days, leaving Catherine to manage the property with Peter Sullivan, Carmen Flores, and the 2 handlers they'd hired during the expansion. Catherine had just finished the evening accounts and was preparing for bed when she smelled smoke. Not the pleasant wood smoke from a fireplace, but the acrid chemical smell of accelerant burning. She rushed from her room to find the new barn, the one they'd spent 6 months building to house their breeding stock, engulfed in flames that were spreading with impossible speed. Catherine's scream brought everyone running. Peter and the handlers grabbed buckets and began the desperate, futile work of trying to fight a fire that was already beyond control. Carmen appeared with more water, but it was immediately clear that the barn couldn't be saved. The only hope was getting the horses out before the structure collapsed. Peter managed to lead 3 mares to safety before the heat became too intense. One of the handlers, a young man named Miguel Torres, went deeper into the barn after the Andalusian stallion's daughter, a 2-year-old filly that represented some of their finest bloodline work. He emerged with the filly in severe burns on his hands and arms, his clothing singed and smoking. But 6 other horses remained trapped inside when the barn's roof gave way with a sound like the earth splitting open, and their screams ended abruptly under tons of burning timber. The Bakersfield Fire Brigade arrived too late to save the barn, but in time to prevent the fire from spreading to other structures. They worked through the night containing the blaze, and by dawn, all that remained was a blackened skeleton of beams and posts marking where the new barn had stood. Catherine sat in the yard, her face blackened with soot and ash, watching the last flames die. She'd lost 6 horses worth over $3,000 plus the barn itself, representing another $2,000 in construction costs. The financial damage was severe, but the loss of breeding stock was worse. Years of careful bloodline development had been destroyed in one night. The fire marshal made his assessment as the sun rose over the ruins. Arson, he said, pointing to char patterns that indicated multiple ignition points and evidence of kerosene used as accelerant. Someone planned this carefully, waited until your property was minimally staffed, used enough accelerant to ensure the fire would spread too fast to control, targeted the new barn where your most valuable stock was housed. This wasn't random vandalism. This was calculated destruction. Who would do such a thing? Peter Sullivan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. That's for the sheriff to investigate, the fire marshal replied carefully. but I'll note in my report that this fire was professional work. Someone who understood how to maximize damage and minimize evidence. The sheriff arrived later that morning, took statements from everyone present, examined the ruins, and made careful notes about the timing and methods. When he asked Catherine if she knew anyone who might want to damage her property, she hesitated for a long moment before answering. "You should speak with my father, Thomas Whitfield. He's made no secret of his displeasure with the arrangement between Mr. Cortez and myself, but I have no direct evidence connecting him to this fire." The sheriff's expression suggested he'd already reached the same conclusion, but appreciated Catherine's careful phrasing. "I'll make inquiries, Miss Whitfield. In the meantime, I'd recommend increasing security around your property. If someone was willing to burn your barn once, they might try again." Diego returned from Arizona 3 days later to find his operation devastated and Catherine exhausted from 72 hours of dealing with the aftermath. She'd already begun making arrangements to rebuild, had contacted their insurance company about the limited coverage they carried, and had reorganized their surviving stock to maximize the breeding potential of the animals that remained. But when Diego examined the full extent of the damage and read the fire marshal's report, his face went cold in ways that frightened Catherine more than the fire had. "Your father did this," Diego said quietly. "We can't prove it, but we both know it was him." "The sheriff is investigating," Catherine replied. "We should let the law handle this. The law won't touch Thomas Whitfield without evidence, and he was careful not to leave any. He hired this done by someone who knows how to make fires look like accidents or random arson. We'll never prove his involvement." Diego turned to face Catherine. "I brought this on you. My revenge on your father has escalated into violence, and you're caught in the middle. That barn burning was a message to both of us. He's done tolerating the humiliation, and he's willing to destroy what we've built to restore his sense of control. Then we rebuild," Catherine said firmly. "We rebuild bigger and better than before. We prove that he can't stop us through violence any more than he could through legal challenges." No, Diego's voice was flat. "We don't risk your life or anyone else's by continuing to provoke a man who's demonstrated he's willing to commit arson. This has gone too far. I'm going to offer your father a settlement. I'll return his daughter, cancel any business competition, and remove myself from Kern County entirely if necessary. Your safety is worth more than my revenge or our business success." Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're giving up? After everything we've built, after proving that I'm worth more than he ever recognized, you're going to hand me back to him like property he left behind? I'm trying to protect you from a dangerous man who's shown he'll escalate to violence. Your father nearly killed 6 horses and could have killed Miguel or anyone else who was in that barn. Next time, he might target the house while you're sleeping. I won't risk that, Catherine. I won't. You don't get to make that decision for me," Catherine said, her voice rising. "I'm not your property to return or your responsibility to manage. I'm a partner in this business and an adult woman who gets to choose what risks she's willing to take. And I'm telling you now, I won't go back to my father's house. I won't give him the satisfaction of believing he can terrorize me into submission. We're going to rebuild this operation, and we're going to make it succeed. And if my father burns down another barn, we'll rebuild that one too." They argued for another hour, with Diego insisting he needed to protect Catherine and Catherine insisting she didn't need protection. She needed support in fighting back against a man who'd spent years trying to crush her spirit. Finally, exhausted and unable to resolve their disagreement, they agreed to table the discussion until they'd both had time to think more clearly. But that night, alone in her room, Catherine made a decision. She would confront her father directly, force him to acknowledge what he'd done, and make clear that she would never return to his control regardless of how much violence he directed at Diego's property. If Thomas Whitfield wanted to destroy what she'd built, he would have to look her in the face while doing it. Catherine rode to the Whitfield ranch the next morning, alone and unannounced, covering the 20 miles before anyone could stop her or insist on accompanying her. She arrived at mid-morning to find her father in the ranch yard, supervising work on a new corral. Thomas looked up as Catherine dismounted, and for a moment, shock registered on his face. He hadn't seen his daughter in nearly 2 years, and the transformation was profound. Catherine had lost over 80 pounds, and while she remained larger than conventional beauty standards demanded, she moved with confidence and strength that bore no resemblance to the defeated woman who'd signed custody documents in June 1871. "Catherine," Thomas said, recovering his composure. This is unexpected. You burned Diego's barn. Catherine's voice was level, stating fact rather than making accusation. You hired someone to set that fire and you killed 6 horses doing it. I'm here to tell you it won't work. I won't be frightened into returning to your house. And you won't destroy what we've built no matter how much property you damage. Thomas glanced at the workers within earshot, then gestured toward the ranch house. If you're going to make wild accusations, at least have the courtesy to make them privately. They walked to his study, a room Catherine remembered from her childhood as forbidden territory, where her father conducted business she wasn't meant to understand. Thomas closed the door and turned to face his daughter, his expression unreadable. I don't know what you're talking about, he said carefully. I had nothing to do with any fire. Yes, you did. You can't prove you didn't do it, and I can't prove you did, so let's dispense with the pretense. You've been humiliated by my success in Diego's household. Every business achievement I've accomplished reminds people that you traded me away, that you valued a horse more than your own daughter. You can't tolerate being proven wrong, so you've escalated to violence. You burned that barn thinking it would force Diego to return me, or force me to flee back to your protection. Catherine stepped closer to her father, her voice hardening. But it won't work. I will never come back here. I would rather die in another barn fire than spend another day under your roof being treated as a burden you tolerate out of obligation. Thomas's face darkened with anger. You have no idea what you're talking about. I spent 23 years providing for you, giving you every advantage, paying for expensive education that you wasted by becoming so fat no respectable man would consider marrying you. And how did you repay that investment? By making a spectacle of yourself, embarrassing this family, and then agreeing to be traded away like livestock because a Mexican horse trader offered you the chance to play at being useful. I'm not playing at anything, Catherine said coldly. I'm managing a business that generates more profit annually than your ranch has seen in 5 years. I'm negotiating deals with buyers throughout California and beyond. I'm using the education you paid for to build something extraordinary. And every day that I succeed is another day that proves you were catastrophically wrong about my value and capability. You're my daughter, Thomas said, his voice rising. You belong in this family, not working for some immigrant who manipulated you into signing away your rights. I made a mistake agreeing to that arrangement, and I'm prepared to correct it. You can return to this house with full family privileges restored, or you can continue with Cortez and face the consequences of that choice. What consequences? Catherine asked. More fires? More property destruction? Are you threatening to kill me, Father? 'Cause that's what you're describing. Escalating violence until either Diego surrenders or I die. Is that really what your pride demands? Your daughter's death to avoid admitting you were wrong about her? Thomas stared at his daughter for a long moment, emotions warring across his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter but no less cold. I never wanted this. Never wanted you to become what you are. I tried to give you the life you were supposed to have, but you rejected it through your weakness and lack of discipline. Cortez exploited that weakness, and now you're both paying the price for defying the natural order of how things should be. The natural order. Catherine repeated slowly. You mean the order where daughters exist only to enhance their father's social standing through advantageous marriages? Where a woman's worth is measured entirely by her appearance and her ability to connect powerful families? Where intelligence and capability mean nothing if they come in a body that doesn't meet narrow standards of acceptability. That natural order is a lie, Father, and I've proven it by building a life that has meaning and purpose beyond serving as decoration in your house. You've proven nothing except that you're willing to humiliate yourself and this family by working like a common clerk for a man who bought you with a horse. He didn't buy me. You gave me away because you saw me as worthless. And I accepted that arrangement because it offered me something you never did. Respect. The opportunity to use my mind. Partnership with someone who values my contributions. You threw me away, Father, and Diego caught me and helped me become something better than I ever could have been under your roof. That's not exploitation. That's liberation. Thomas turned away, staring out his study window at the ranch he'd spent decades building. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. I wanted you to have a good life. A proper life. Everything I did was meant to position you for success in the world as it exists, not as you wish it were. No, Catherine said. Everything you did was meant to position yourself for success, and I was just a tool you planned to use toward that goal. When I stopped being useful in the ways you valued, you discarded me. You don't get to pretend this was about my welfare, Father. This was always about your ambitions and your reputation. I was never a daughter to you. I was an investment that failed to generate the return you expected. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Father and daughter faced each other across a distance that had nothing to do with the physical space between them and everything to do with wounds that would never heal. Finally, Thomas spoke. Get out of my house. Go back to your Mexican horse trader and your delusions about meaningful work. But understand this, Catherine. You've burned every bridge that connected you to this family. When Cortez tires of you, when his business fails or his interest in your services ends, don't come here expecting reconciliation. You made your choice, and it's final. Good, Catherine said, because I would never come back here under any circumstances. You're not my father anymore, Thomas. You're just the man who was too stupid to recognize quality when it was sitting in his own house. Goodbye. Catherine walked out of the Whitfield ranch house and rode back to Bakersfield without looking back. She arrived to find Diego waiting anxiously, having discovered her absence and correctly guessed where she'd gone. You went to confront him alone, Diego said, anger and relief mixing in his voice. That was incredibly dangerous. It was necessary, Catherine replied. He needed to hear directly from me that I won't be intimidated or forced back under his control. And I needed to hear him admit, finally, that he values his pride more than his daughter's life. We're clear now about where we stand. And where is that? Diego asked. We're at war, Catherine said simply. My father won't stop until he's destroyed what we've built, or we've made his continued attacks more costly than his pride can afford. So we're going to rebuild that barn, expand our operation, and make it so successful that every day of his life reminds him that trading me away was the worst decision he ever made. That's the revenge that matters, Diego, not fire or violence or legal battles. Success so overwhelming it becomes torture for the person who tried to destroy us. They rebuilt. Through spring and summer of 1873, Catherine and Diego reconstructed the operation with improvements that made it superior to what had existed before the fire. A new barn, larger and fire-resistant in ways the previous structure hadn't been. Additional breeding stock purchased from Montana and Oregon, diversifying their bloodlines beyond California sources. Expanded training facilities that allowed them to prepare horses for specific buyers' needs rather than general sales. Security measures that made future sabotage much more difficult, including night watchmen and a dog that Peter Sullivan trained specifically for property protection. The rebuilding cost them most of their capital reserves and required loans that would take years to repay. But by autumn of 1873, Diego Cortez's operation had emerged from the fire stronger than before. More importantly, the story of the barn burning and Catherine's confrontation with her father had spread throughout Kern County, and public opinion had shifted decisively against Thomas Whitfield. People might have tolerated the courthouse transaction as an unfortunate but legal arrangement between two men. But arson that killed valuable horses and could have killed workers crossed lines that even Thomas's remaining supporters couldn't justify. The sheriff's investigation never produced formal charges. No witnesses came forward, and the hired arsonist, if there had been one, had vanished without leaving evidence connecting him to Thomas Whitfield. But the absence of legal consequences didn't prevent social ones. Thomas found himself increasingly isolated, his business relationships strained by association with suspected criminal activity. The Agricultural Association asked him to resign his membership. The Masonic Lodge suspended his participation pending resolution of questions about his character. Within 6 months of the barn burning, Thomas Whitfield had been effectively expelled from the community leadership positions he'd worked decades to achieve, and Catherine thrived. Her weight continued dropping until she'd lost nearly 100 pounds from her highest point. And while she would never fit conventional beauty standards, she'd regained health and mobility that transformed her daily life. More significantly, her business reputation had expanded beyond Bakersfield. She was invited to speak at a commercial development forum in Sacramento about women in business management. She published an article in a San Francisco agricultural journal about breeding stock evaluation and market analysis. She became in her own right a recognized expert in horse breeding commerce, sought after for her advice and respected for her capabilities. Diego's operation grew to become one of the 3 largest horse breeding businesses in California. By 1875, they employed 8 people, maintained over 40 horses at various stages of training and development, and had established buying relationships in 6 states and territories. The revenge Diego had planned, forcing Thomas Whitfield to publicly trade away something valuable, had succeeded beyond his initial vision. But it had also evolved into something more than revenge. It had become a genuine partnership between 2 people who'd found in each other the respect and purpose that society had denied them. Thomas Whitfield watched all of this from increasing distance. His ranch continued operating profitably, but without the growth or prominence he'd once enjoyed. The Andalusian stallion remained valuable, but its association with Diego's operation meant that Thomas could never fully claim credit for the bloodline's quality. His wife Abigail grew distant, never openly blaming him for Catherine's absence, but clearly harboring resentments that eroded their marriage. His social standing, so carefully cultivated, had been destroyed by a series of decisions that had seemed rational at the time, but that circumstances had revealed as profound failures of judgment and character. In 1877, 6 years after the courthouse transaction, Thomas Whitfield suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to manage his ranch effectively. Abigail wrote to Catherine with news of her father's condition, a letter that was carefully neutral in tone, but that clearly suggested Catherine might want to visit. Catherine considered the letter for 3 days before writing her response. She expressed hope for her father's recovery, but declined to visit, explaining that she'd built a life separate from the Whitfield family and saw no purpose in returning to circumstances that had once nearly destroyed her. The letter was polite but final, closing a door that had been slowly swinging shut for 6 years. Thomas Whitfield died in 1882, 11 years after trading his daughter for a horse. His obituary in the Bakersfield newspaper mentioned his successful ranching career and his contributions to Kern County's agricultural development. It did not mention Catherine. The funeral was well attended by people who'd done business with Thomas over the decades, but noticeably absent were the community leaders and social elite who had once considered him one of their own. Catherine did not attend her father's funeral. She sent flowers with a card that read simply, "You taught me what I was worth. Thank you for being wrong." The ambiguity of the message was deliberate, offering surface respect while containing layers of meaning that anyone who knew their story would understand. By 1882, Catherine was 34 years old and had spent 11 years as Diego Cortez's business partner. The arrangement between them had evolved in ways that would have surprised anyone who'd witnessed the courthouse transaction. They'd developed genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared success. They'd created a business that employed dozens of people and was recognized throughout the western states. And they'd proven definitively that the transaction everyone had viewed as exploitation had actually been liberation for both parties involved. Diego never married, finding that his partnership with Catherine satisfied his needs for companionship and intellectual connection better than any conventional relationship could. Catherine never married either, discovering that independence and meaningful work offered more fulfillment than any domestic arrangement could provide in 1880s California. Their relationship remained professional and platonic, but it was also deep and significant in ways that transcended conventional categories. The courthouse documents that had initiated everything remained filed in Anderson County's legal archives, occasionally discovered by researchers examining unusual California contracts from the frontier period. The story of the woman who was traded for a horse became one of those historical anecdotes that people shared as evidence of how barbaric the past had been, how much progress civilization had made in recognizing human dignity and rights. Most people who heard the story never learned what happened afterward, never knew that the woman who'd been traded had built an extraordinary business career, that she'd transformed trauma into triumph, that she'd proven her father catastrophically wrong about her value and potential. Catherine Rose Whitfield, later known professionally as Catherine Cortez, though she never legally changed her name, spent 37 years managing and expanding the horse breeding operation she'd helped build. She died in 1908 at age 60, respected throughout California's agricultural community, and wealthy enough to leave substantial bequests to women's educational institutions. Her obituary, unlike her father's, mentioned the courthouse transaction explicitly, but framed it as the beginning of a remarkable business career rather than an embarrassing scandal. Diego Mateo Cortez outlived Catherine by 6 years, dying in 1914 at age 76. His will left the entire business to a foundation that provided business training and startup capital for immigrants seeking commercial opportunities in California. The foundation operated for decades, helping hundreds of people build businesses in circumstances where conventional financing and social connections would have been unavailable. It was Diego's final act of revenge against a society that had tried to marginalize him, proving that the Mexican horse trader Thomas Whitfield had dismissed as beneath contempt had built something more lasting and significant than most of California's Anglo elite ever achieved. The Andalusian stallion that started everything lived until 1889, producing over 60 offspring whose bloodlines can still be traced in modern Morgan and Andalusian registries. Horses descended from that single animal helped build breeding programs throughout the western United States, and their value far exceeded the $800 Thomas Whitfield had originally estimated when agreeing to the trade. The story people tell now, when they tell it at all, is usually framed as a cautionary tale about the treatment of women in frontier California, about how daughters were viewed as property and how social pressure forced women into circumstances they never would have chosen freely. Those interpretations aren't wrong exactly, but they miss something essential about what actually happened in June 1871 outside that Bakersfield ranch house. Catherine Rose Whitfield wasn't just a victim of her father's cruelty or a pawn in Diego Cortez's revenge scheme. She was an intelligent, capable woman who recognized an opportunity for liberation when it presented itself, even though that opportunity came packaged in the most humiliating transaction imaginable. She chose exile over continued imprisonment, chose the risk of an uncertain arrangement over the certainty of slow death in her father's house, chose to be someone's weapon if that meant finally being someone's something. And in making that choice, Catherine discovered something her father never understood. That value isn't determined by appearance or social positioning or how well someone fits into conventional expectations. That capability matters more than decoration. That respect matters more than comfort. That building something meaningful, even if society judges the foundation, matters more than hiding from judgment while building nothing at all. Thomas Whitfield traded his daughter for a horse, thinking he was exchanging worthless burden for valuable asset. What he actually did was give away the most valuable thing he possessed while gaining something that would forever remind him of his catastrophic failure of judgment. The revenge Diego Cortez orchestrated was elegant and thorough, but it succeeded only because Thomas had made himself vulnerable through his own cruelty and blindness. The courthouse documents survive in archives, occasionally examined by historians studying unusual legal arrangements from California's territorial period. The barn Diego built after the fire still stands, converted now into a museum dedicated to early California horse breeding history. Catherine's business ledgers, preserved by the foundation Diego established, show the careful systems and precise analysis that transformed a struggling trading operation into a major commercial enterprise. These are the physical remnants of a story that seems almost impossible, a transaction so shocking that people struggle to believe it actually happened. But it did happen. In June 1871, in Kern County, California, a father traded his daughter for a horse, and that daughter spent the next 37 years proving that her father's assessment of her worth was the most expensive mistake he ever made. The revenge that followed shook California not through violence or scandal, but through the simple, devastating demonstration that what one man had discarded as worthless was actually extraordinary, and that sometimes liberation comes not from fighting the system directly, but from using the system's own cruelty against itself to create opportunities that shouldn't exist but that become real, anyway because someone is brave enough or desperate enough or calculating enough to seize them. Catherine Rose Whitfield was traded for a horse, and she turned that transaction into a triumph that echoed through California history, a reminder that the value we assign to people says more about our judgment than about their worth, and that being discarded by someone who never valued us properly can be sometimes the greatest gift we never knew we needed.